I have seen this question a lot. It's possibly one of the most frequently asked questions in interviews. What is the difference between SparkContext and SparkSession? We all know that both are entry points to Spark applications. Then why is everyone getting confused? It's all because of the history. In the early versions of Spark, we had the SparkContext, which is the primary entry point to the Spark application. SparkContext stored cluster details, offered a core API and didn't allow SQL in those early versions. Using SparkContext, every Spark application can communicate with data sources and perform certain operations, such as reading and writing data. Let's see the code snippet we used to create SparkContext in the early versions. First, we need to create a SparkConf instance. It is done by assigning an application name and setting a master. Then pass the SparkConf object as an argument to the SparkContext constructor to create the SparkContext. Using the SparkContext object, we will be able to create a Spark RDD. Later Spark 1.0 was introduced. Many new features, including SQLContext, HiveContext, and streaming context, were added to Spark. Each of these has a specific use. For instance, SQLContext is the entry point to Spark SQL, which is a Spark module for structured data processing. For example, we use this code snippet to create SQLContext. As you can see here, we are creating SparkContext object and passing it as an argument to SQLContext constructor to create SQLContext. Once SQLContext is initialized, the user can then use it in order to perform various SQL-like operations over datasets and data frames. They also allow running of Hive SQL. But for that, you must create a HiveContext. HiveContext also offers support for window functions. Similar to SQLContext, we can create HiveContext and perform various HQL-like operations over datasets and data frames. From all this, one thing is clear. SparkContext was at the core. We always needed to create SparkContext to be able to connect to the cluster and use the RDD APIs. Then they introduced Spark 2.0. In this, they encapsulated the different types of contexts into one single object and named it as SparkSession. This SparkSession now includes all the API which were available in the different contexts. And it takes SparkContext as an input so it can connect to the cluster and use RDD API internally. The SparkSession offers you data frame and SQL functionality. Let's see the code snippet we used to create SparkSession. As you can see, here also we are passing SparkContext object as an argument to SparkSession constructor to create SparkSession. Because the SparkContext is the main object that establishes the connection to the Spark cluster. This code looked clumsy because we needed to create SparkContext and then pass it to create SparkSession. For this issue, we have solution. Session Builder. The Session Builder will internally create the SparkContext and manage cluster connection, and if needed, it will also enable connection to Hive. This code is the standard approach nowadays. We do not create SparkContext now. We only create SparkSession, and SparkSession Builder will create the SparkContext for us and keep it inside the SparkSession. Now let me ask the question again. What is the difference between SparkContext and SparkSession? SparkContext offers the core Spark functionality, maintains the connection to the Spark cluster, and handles RDD APIs. SparkSession offers data frame and Spark SQL functionally. SparkSession will still create SparkContext behind the scenes.